this presentation is very, very different than the last one. Last one was sort of a general orientation. Obviously, I didn't talk about Nehemiah at all. This one really won't talk much about Nehemiah, but the events leading into the narrative of the Ezra-Nehemiah episode. Also, there'll be a little more preaching in this one. I make no apologies for that. 25 years being a full-time preacher, I keep telling my students, don't be offended when I go into preaching. This is what it's all about, folks. Anyway, as we think in terms of events leading up to this, the destruction of Jerusalem was an extremely critical point. Sometimes we have a tendency to, this is my scenario, okay? Now, please understand, Old Testament is sort of the domain within which I academically tend to operate. I am a New Testament Christian, though, just to make it clear, all right? But this is the academic world within which I operate. There are three descriptions of the Babylonian approach to Jerusalem. One is in 605, which a lot of academics will argue doesn't exist. Then there's the 597, 596 one, and then there's the 586, 587, 586. It appears that the Babylonians were attempting not to have to do anything with all of this. I mean, they wanted to bring Judah into submission, but they really apparently had no design to obliterate the country. So in the 605, when they take Daniel and others into captivity and some of the goods from the temple, it was sort of a smack them around, okay, look what we can do, you submit yourself to us and everything will be fine. In similar fashion, sort of to what the Assyrians occasionally would do. The Hebrew folks, well, you remember Ezekiel, he talks about them, for they are a rebellious people. Okay, so the ancient Israelites rebel, and so the Babylonians have to come back around too. Okay, so 597, they come back, and they have to take more people into exile, among whom now is Ezekiel, and additional material from the temple, again, apparently hoping again that this will be sufficient to keep the country of Judah in check. They're not. Apparently within this framework is when Jeremiah comes in. And in this famous temple sermon in Jeremiah chapter 7, don't think to yourselves, the temple of the Lord is here, the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord. And Jeremiah says, don't put your confidence in this temple as just as an insurance policy. Remember Shiloh. Remember where God caused His name to dwell at the beginning and how it's obliterated now. This ought to be a lesson to you. Don't place your trust in simply the fact that the temple is here. And hence Jeremiah argues with them and pleads with them, God through Jeremiah, to come back to Him in repentance. But they refuse. And then you have Ezekiel and the vision of the Spirit of the Lord leaving the temple. And so the temple is now unprotected. Now, as long as God was there, there would be protection, but God's left it now. And so when the Babylonians come with the determination, we're not going to have to come back here another time. Let's wipe out the very item that defines them. Let's obliterate this temple. Let's destroy this city. Let's wipe it off the map, if you will. It's similar to what happened, the attempt that was made on the United States in 2001. Because they thought that if they could do that Trade Center and the Pentagon and whatever other building they were after, it would have demoralized, and it did demoralize us, but they didn't recognize what was going to happen in our situation. But when the Babylonians come to destroy the temple, the people are just deflated, and they destroy the city with a vengeance. I think it was Brother Leon, I forget which one was speaking last night. The two speakers, one of them talked about the Babylonians knew how to destroy cities. I apologize, I don't remember which one was speaking. Dennis, okay. Now, here is part of the evidence of that. If you visit Jerusalem today, this is the Milo that is often pointed out. I don't know how many of you have gone down the slopes and looked at this, but there's some really fascinating elements in here. Most notably is a toilet seat. Right there is the toilet seat. Things haven't changed much. This is going to sound weird. Archaeologists love trash. And when the archaeologists found this toilet seat, they went nuts. Because as you look at the stratigraphy, and in the study of the stratigraphy of the latrine, this tells you how people live. And how people live is important. Now, oftentimes in the news and so forth, the PR issues, it's often skewed. But when you get past that and look at the trash and look at what people are really doing and go into their houses, this is when you find out really how they're living. Jeremiah chapter 52, Jeremiah writes, "And Zedekiah rebelled against the king of Babylon. And in the 9th year of his reign, in the 10th month, on the 10th day of the month, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came with all his army against Jerusalem and laid siege to it. And they built siege works all around it. So the city was besieged to the 11th year of King Zedekiah. And on the 9th day of the 4th month, the famine was so severe in the city that there was no food for the people in the land." And the archaeologists found exactly that scenario. In the excavation through the latrine, the upper level showed the people were eating weeds to try to survive. Besieging had to be a horrible strategy if you were the victim. Because when you run out of resources, what do you eat? The Assyrians allude to this. The Rabshakeh does when he's talking with Hezekiah earlier. But these are the extremes to which people will resort. And the archaeological evidence demonstrates the severity of this destruction. Not just from the standpoint of the destruction of the site, but also of what the people had to eat. Further excavations at Babylon have revealed that Jehoiakim, who is referred to earlier in the narrative, who was taken off into captivity, became a subject of the kings. And there's this list of royal rations where they're going to support and take care of Jehoiakim. The Bible will refer to the fact that the king eventually comes along and he liberates Jehoiakim from his prison. So we have now not only the declaration of the Bible, not that any of us question that, but you have this ration list that is described within some of these archives. In the excavation of some of the areas, particularly after the Israelis took over the area in 1967, I don't know if you can see over here in the lower right-hand corner these arrowheads where the Babylonians would have shot the arrows in, and you have this collection and cluster of the arrowheads down in the corner. I mean, this is sort of a graphic kind of reality. I mean, this is hands-on kind of stuff. The intensity of the conflict. You're dealing with life and death here. This destruction was formidable. Now, Cyrus, of course, is going to come to the throne of the Persians. And this is a map showing sort of the original area that tended to characterize. Now, obviously, the Cyrus and the Persians expands significantly as time passes. And eventually, though, he's, of course, going to capture Babylon. And one of the things, coming back to this, one of the things that the Persians are going to do is build a road from Sardis over here. The little white line represents the road that goes all the way down to Susa. This one shows it in red a little more clearly. I mean, it's a long road. It's sort of like their freeway system of the ancient world. And the Persians were really efficient at sending out messages. If you remember the story in the book of Esther, which I'll allude to then in the next session as it sets the scene for Ezra and Nehemiah and further. But the Persians were really into sending out the messages and this royal road. And if you go to Sardis today, this is a remnant of part of that road that went from Sardis all the way to Susa, their freeway system. Romans weren't the first one to build roads. We often give Romans credit for things they don't deserve. Not that I'm anti-Roman, but anyway. Cyrus, of course, is going to capture the city of Babylon. And when he comes into the city, he is viewed as a liberator. Now, Nabonidus had been the king earlier, but the Nabonidus had abandoned the city. He was off gallivanting around, doing other things down in Tema down here. And the people in Babylon, at least according to Cyrus, the people in Babylon looked at Cyrus as the great liberator. They welcomed him with open arms because he's going to come back and restore the worship of Marduk and all of that kind of thing. Now, the Cyrus cylinder that I have up here is the item from which we have a lot of this information. By the way, this is a full-size reproduction. It's not the real item, by the way. But this is a full-size reproduction. This is not a massive document, but it does say a lot. And if you're familiar with James Pritchard's Ancient Near Eastern Texts, You certainly can have access to the translation of this. And it's a really exciting document because toward the end of that, he talks about liberating all of the peoples that the Babylonians had taken into captivity and allowing them to return home, repatriating the goods and the gods that the Babylonians had taken away. I sort of picture this looking like the end of the Raiders of the Lost Ark in this big storehouse. And then breaking into it, it says, here, take your gods home, take your gods home. Of course, for Israel, there are no gods to take home. And hence, in the description at the beginning of Ezra, all they're taking back are a lot of implements, gold and vessels and jars and all kinds of implements of that nature, because there's no artifact of God. There's not even an ark. Don't get me on that one. I have a whole lecture on the Ark of the Covenant. Where is the Ark of the Covenant? But you don't want to hear that one, do you? Anyway, here's a picture of the Cyrus Decree in the British Museum. Now, this artifact here, I've got to step down here because I've got to get my translation. I don't have this memorized. By the way, this is a paperback version of a smaller rendition of that ancient Near Eastern text. You can get this real cheap if you go on Amazon. Leonard Woolley, when he's excavating at Ur, this is the reconstruction at Ur, and in the Timanus wall, finds this mud brick that has a stamp on it. And the stamp reads, Cyrus, king of the world, king of Ansham, son of Cambyses, king of Ansham. The great gods delivered all the lands into my hand, and I made this land to dwell in peace. You get the impression that Cyrus is a bit of a narcissist. King of the world, but then he's following in the tradition of the Assyrians and the Babylonians. They would often refer to themselves in similar fashion. I really doubt seriously that Cyrus knew that the Lord was using him for his particular purpose. Isaiah certainly prophesies of this as he talks about my servant Cyrus. And if you look actually carefully at the text in Isaiah, it indicates that Cyrus isn't aware of God's operation here. But certainly Cyrus is a tool that the Lord is using to accomplish another goal. Now tuck that away because I'm going to come back to that principle as we go into the later, assuming you all decide to come back. Anyway, so Zerubbabel is going to be returning, and he and Shealtiel, a lot of discussion as to who these two people are and how they should be related to one another, but I'll leave all that alone. So they return. Usually it's understood that they return by this longer route, rather than this other one that they postulate here Ezra uses at a later time. Envision a caravan, something like that, of donkeys and camels traveling, and it's taking a long time. It takes, this is not a trip that you make overnight. This is weeks at a time that are involved in order to make this trip, and the hazards that are intrinsic in that, especially when you're carrying back gold and silver implements, and if anybody knows about that, and the risk of being attacked, and the faith that they have to have that God is going to take them back to this land that He has promised them, to which they're now returning. And when they arrive back at the site of Jerusalem, they're going to find the temple in ruins. This is a photograph of some of the ruins, not dated to, these are not from Jerusalem, but these are some of the ruins that we ran into at Tel Bet Shemesh, just to give you some sense of the kind of thing that perhaps, in essence, the children of Israel would have encountered. This is a mud brick wall that was burned at a much, much earlier period, but it was burned and the whole building collapsed. We dug through about this deep of material through all of just intensely burned mud brick, till finally we hit the surface of this palace that we're excavating, dating to the 14th century BC. Here are some of the other mud bricks tumbled into this, and the intensity of the heat. Remember, this is just mud brick. These are bricks literally made out of mud. But the fire was so intense that these in the destruction were burned solid like stone. The bricks are about 5 inches thick and about 9 to 12 inches square. You've got to have a pretty intense fire to fire this without it being in a kiln. Now, don't know exactly what all of the scenario was that the children of Israel encountered when they finally get back to Jerusalem. But certainly they're going to face a lot of rubble, a lot of destruction. They're going to have to do a lot of cleanup. And one of the challenges that they're going to figure out is, what do we do first? I suspect there were probably discussions on the way. What is the first thing we're going to do when we get there? What's the first thing? Well, if we're going to restore the worship that needs to be restored, we need to build a temple. Obviously, that's the focal point, where God has caused His name to dwell. Deuteronomy chapter 12 and 1 Kings 8 and other passages where this becomes an extremely important component. God had made it absolutely clear in Deuteronomy 12 that when you get into the promised land, don't you build and offer sacrifices just anywhere you choose, but the place where I cause my name to dwell, that's where you build your offering, bring your offerings and your sacrifices. Solomon makes it explicitly clear that it's the temple in Jerusalem where that's going to occur. The Israelites have learned a lesson, not maybe necessarily all their lessons, but they realize we can't offer sacrifices just anywhere. So we need to focus here. Let's rebuild the temple, but let's build the altar first. I've had someone ask me several years ago, well, how would they know where the altar was if everything was all destroyed? Well, this is an altar. It's not the same size as the one that they apparently built in Jerusalem. But this is an altar reconstruction of the original pieces from Beersheba. It stands about this tall, and it's about 5-6 feet square. And but if you at Dan, in the excavations at Dan, and I realize this is not Jerusalem because we have not uncovered that location at Jerusalem for fairly obvious reasons, if you think about it. But at the side of Dan, in the excavations, they found the footprint of where the altar was. In this case, they built this space frame kind of structure over it to give you some impression as to what the altar looked like, in part based upon one of the horns that was discovered at Dan. And so they're looking at the footprint and everything else, and I suspect that when the children of Israel returned to Jerusalem, they could find, after clearing out the rubble, the footprint of where the altar was. And so they rebuild the altar to initiate their legitimate worship, offering up sacrifices at the place where God caused His name to dwell. Admittedly, the temple's not there, but I think we need to admire them. They're doing what they can with what they got, as quickly as they can do it, because they want to restore as best they can the worship as God has prescribed. I hear people today talk about, this restoration idea, it's all out of date, it's unworkable. Have you read your Bibles lately? There's several of these restorations that take place in the text. And it's based upon looking at the book, as Brother Parker this morning talked about. Looking at the book. What does the book say? We can know what to do because God has revealed that to us if we'll open our eyes and look at it. And that's exactly what the children of Israel are attempting to do as best they can under the circumstances. And admittedly, it's going to be a challenge for them. Among the things that they're going to need to do is to get cedars from Lebanon. They've gotten permission from the king to do this. Lebanon, of course, is way up here at the northern part of this map. This is a picture of a cedar from Lebanon. And they're going to float them down the coast. The Bible makes it clear that they bring them down the coast by the sea to Joppa. I don't know exactly what that would have looked like, but here is a photograph of some lumber companies floating clusters of logs down a river or whatever, and I'm sure it would have been similar kind of situation, lashing these together or looping them into a boundary and floating them down the coast, and finally when they get there, then they take them out of the water at Joppa. So it's Joppa where they're going to go. Solomon, of course, has a description of the cedars of Lebanon and as part of his construction of the temple. I don't know that they necessarily had to have cedars from Lebanon, but nonetheless, they're trying to go back as best they can to the glory of the temple as delineated in the pages of Scripture. This is the port of Joppa as it may be seen today. Footnote here, Joppa is also where Jonah gets on a boat and takes off the other direction. It's also where Peter is going to be when he's at the house of Simon the tanner and he gets his invitation to go to Caesarea. Fascinating article in the Biblical Archeology Review back a few years ago. I highly recommend that you look at this. It's sort of tedious read, but nonetheless it's fascinating. This is a picture of a renovation of the Al-Aqsa Mosque there in Jerusalem back in the, I think it's 20s or 30s, I forget when. And look at these timbers that are here. And here are those timbers as they may now be seen. It's 2013 in the BAR, Biblical Archaeology Review. And studies of these timbers have prompted some to argue that some of these timbers actually may be from the original temple in Jerusalem. Wow. Current politics being as they are, once the other side got wind of this, I will not name the other side, But once the other side got wind of this, they've hidden it and won't let anybody look at them, because they're afraid it'll be justification for building the temple or the modern state of Israel, which in my opinion has nothing to do with anything here. But they don't ask me. But it's fascinating. They were repairing this. They removed these timbers, and now at least they didn't destroy them. But they're covered up in something, and they won't let you over there at all. But it's a fascinating narrative. Now, the Bible will talk about this description. Look at Ezra chapter 3. You have this construction technique that's a little unusual. It catches most people a little by surprise. They don't know exactly what's going on. And for a long time, there were discussions of what this construction technique entails. Chapter 3, verses 10. And when the builders laid the foundation of the temple of the Lord, the priests in their vestments came forward with trumpets, and the Levites, the sons of Asaph, with cymbals to praise the Lord according to the directions of the king David, the king of Israel. And they sang responsively, praising and giving thanks to the Lord, for he is good, for his steadfast love endures forever toward Israel. And all the people shouted with a great shout when they praised the Lord, because the foundations of the house of the Lord was laid. But many of the priests and the Levites, heads of Father's house, old men who had seen the first house, wept with a loud voice when they saw the foundation of this house being laid, though many shouted aloud for joy, so that the people could not distinguish the sound of the joyful shout from the sound of the people's weeping. For the people shouted with a great shout, and the sound was heard far away. The description here, and Haggai has a similar narration, the description here is that mixed emotion as people who had seen the first temple can recognize that the grandeur of this reconstructed one isn't quite going to measure up to what the earlier one had been. But the children who'd never seen the first one were simply exuberant that there's a temple being built. And so those are the mixed emotions that are expressed. The weeping, because this doesn't measure up to the grandeur of the Solomonic temple. But there's the exuberance of the people that there is a temple going up. There are events that certainly we could talk in terms of, that those of us who are older could remember. Those who are younger cannot remember at all. And hence there would be similar kind of situations where there would be similar kinds of mixed emotions. We're looking at a reconstruction of part of the gate at Megiddo. Many of you have been through this. The part down below here is part of the original construction of the gate at Megiddo. It's immaterial, the time period involved here. But as you look at this, you can see this rubble kind of garbage that's up here at the top. That's sort of their reconstruction. It's not very well done. And so as I look at this, I can sort of envision the kind of sentiments that the people would feel. Those who saw the earlier grandeur, and those who see the newer one that doesn't quite have the scale, the diminished grandeur. But you also have another reference in chapter 5, verse 8. You have, be it known to the king that we went to the province of Judah, to the house of the great God. It is built with huge stones, and timber is laid in the walls. And then you have another reference in chapter 6, verse 4, a passing reference. Its height shall be 60 cubits, its breadth 60 cubits, with 3 layers of great stones and 1 layer of timber. For a long time there was a question, what does this mean? What's involved here? Many would argue that you would have 3 layers of stone with a layer of wood. And then more stone built on top of that, and then three layers of stone, and then another layer of wood. And the argument was that the layer of wood was to serve as a cushion in time of earthquakes so that the building wouldn't fall. I'm not an engineer or the son of an engineer, but I did sleep at the Holiday Inn once. Wood crushes over time, especially with a lot of weight on it. And that doesn't really seem to make any sense to me. Now, if some engineer can explain differently to me the flaw in my reasoning here, I'm willing to listen to you. But if you have an entire layer of wood with thousands and thousands and thousands of pounds of stone sitting on top of that, and over time dry rot and whatever else coming into play, it seems like the whole wall would become very unstable over time. A better explanation is actually based upon archaeology, where it has given us some insight. If you go to Dan, the temple, the shrine at Dan, see this See the structure that is here? Now, admittedly, it doesn't have the 3 layers, but see that indentation that it comes around right there? That indentation is designed to accommodate, we would probably call them 2x4s, that serve on a surface, whereas the rest of that underneath is mere stone, the weight of stone sitting on stone and so forth. And it's to give an elaborate breakup of the view of the side of the structure, to give it some beauty. A point counterpoint of white limestone with cedar of Lebanon, let's say. And the color contrast. A good architect will design a wall not of just solid brick, but there'll be something in that to sort of break up the expanse and make it look good. Now what's interesting is, wood is very expensive in the ancient world. They wouldn't just willy-nilly do stuff out of wood that, you and I are accustomed to doing, because we've got wood and trees accessible all over the place. But in this part of the world, wood is an extremely valuable commodity, and they would not simply waste it and squirreling it away inside a building where there would be no particular reason. But the king would have access to wood, and God would have access to wood. And to build a building that has these 3 courses and then a layer of, a streak of wood in it is indicative of royalty. And fairly consistently, as we have traveled around and excavated at a number of sites that certainly appear to be official, there has been this tradition of several courses of stone with a section of wood layer and then several courses of stone, but the wood layer doesn't go all the way through. Now, coming back to Megiddo, here I am standing. You can look behind me, perhaps. Maybe I ought to go back to the other photograph. You can see the wood that has been put in the reconstruction. This is the original construction, but the wood was gone because of rotting. But the restorationists have put wood back into the side of the structure. And this is the kind of thing that is under consideration here. And again, it's characteristic of the royal presentation, the royal authority. And in this case, certainly God being the one under consideration. The northern tribes, what's left of the tribes, come and offer to help. So we have people coming from different places in the north, and they come down to the south, and they say, let us help you build all of this. And so you have in Ezra chapter 4, verses 1 through 3, the offer where they're coming says, please let us help you build this. And Zerubbabel and others, no, we don't want your assistance. Now here's where the problem is. Children of Israel finally recognized, we were sent into exile because we weren't following the will of God. Sometimes you just got to get hit upside the head to figure this one out. And that's why they went in exile. God was sort of hitting them upside the head. And if you look at the northern kingdom of Israel and look at the lineage of the kings, admittedly there's not a one dynastic succession here. There are all kinds of dynasties involved. But beginning with Jeroboam the son of Nevat, who does not have enough faith in the Lord to listen to what God promises him. God promised him. Most people don't quite catch this. If you look a little earlier, it says, God says, Jeroboam, if you will follow me, if you will obey me, I will make your family a dynastic succession just like I have that of David's. I mean, what greater promise could you have? God's on his side. All God's asked is, follow my will. Jeroboam doesn't trust him. Jeroboam ultimately does not believe him. Jeroboam comes along and he takes things into his own hands, and he becomes, if you will, and I don't mean this in a lot of the ways we hear it, he becomes a change agent. He changes the gods, he changes the places of worship, he changes the priesthood, and he establishes rival festivals, all in an attempt to consolidate the kingdom around his rule rather than God's. And of course, involved in that is the setting up of the 2 golden calves, one at Bethel, one at Dan. If you look at almost all of the rest of the kings, the reason I have these other 2, Shallum and Hoshea, they're the only 2 for whom this assessment does not appear. However, they did not depart from the sins of Jeroboam the son of Nevat, or some slight variation of that. Every one of the kings of the north. It doesn't matter how militarily powerful they were, Ahab being one, and Omri being one. It doesn't matter how much wealth they had. Jeroboam the son of Joash is a time of wealth, relatively speaking. It doesn't matter any of the criteria that tend to characterize our assessments of success. God's assessment of success was, are they following God's will? And not a one of them did. Not a one of them did. And so when these mixed representations, these mixed representatives come from the north to offer to help, Zerubbabel, Shealtiel, and the company are saying, we'd rather you didn't. We don't want to get caught in that quagmire again. Now, Sargon II is going to talk about his strategies of dealing with this. And in this prism, he says, the inhabitants of Samarina, which is the Akkadian form of Samaria, the inhabitants of Samarina who agreed and plotted with a king hostile to me, not to do service and not to bring tribute to Ashur, and who did battle, I fought against them with the power of the great gods, my lords. I counted as spoil 27,280 people, together with their chariots and gods in which they trusted. I formed a unit with 200 of their chariots for my royal force. I settled the rest of them in the midst of Assyria. He refers to his own exiling strategies. I settled them in the rest of the midst of Assyria. I repopulated Samarina with more than before by bringing folks from elsewhere, which the Bible tells us in 2 Kings chapter 17. And I brought into it people from countries conquered by my hands, and I appointed my eunuch as governor over them. Now, I have the citation here, and the Bible says they brought their gods with them. The northern kingdom of Israel already had problem with other gods. So a few more gods here, God there, God everywhere, God. You know, they're gung-ho with this. This is nothing new. This is nothing particularly unusual. And this is exactly the kind of problem that Zerubbabel and Shealtiel are concerned about. We don't want you with a vested interest in this attempt to try to reestablish a worship to God. Now, a couple of hundred years later, we have a situation where Alexander the Great comes through. And leading families of Samaria flee and hide in this cave. And the excavations have uncovered this. This is Paul Lapp and the A.A. Soar, Annual American Schools of World Research. Theophoric names are names that people have that have the name of God in it, of some God. So Eshbaal would be man of Baal. Okay. Jeremiah is the Yah part has Yahweh in it. The names in the ostraka and vessels that are in here reflect, look at all these different gods. A god from Edom, a god from the Aram, the Moabite, Canaanite, Babylonian, and yes, Israel as well. A very mixed population. Now, this does not intrinsically mean they're necessarily always worshiping these other gods, but certainly the probability is pretty high. And especially in view of what otherwise we have described within the biblical text, where they are worshiping other gods. And so we can know, and with confidence, that what is going on here is exactly as the Bible describes. We have no reason to challenge that. Zerubbabel is concerned about the risk of religious contamination. He's concerned about the potential compromise. Ezra and Nehemiah will later refuse help in similar fashion and demand, though, separation from mixed marriages. Which, if you actually look at the larger context, if those who are not worshiping Yahweh were to convert to Judaism, everything was going to be fine. But apparently they would refuse to do so. There is a risk of syncretistic influences. It had characterized Israel and Judah both earlier. Zerubbabel and Shealtiel know this. It also had been the issue that precipitated the exile of both of the countries, as narrated in 2 Kings 17 and chapter 21 and chapter 23. It also served as, why should they, Zerubbabel and Shealtiel, assume that things would be any different? This is one of those classic issues. We need to learn something from history, folks. We really do. If they were permitted to come down and assist in the reconstruction and building of this temple, those who were involved in that reconstruction could assume a vested interest in what goes on there. Shealtiel and Zerubbabel are not being cruel-hearted in all of this. They're being realistic in what's happening. And to our world today, this is certainly harsh. But they've finally learned a lesson after hundreds of years trying to wrestle with all this. And so these northern folks, and I'm sort of fast-forwarding here, I'll talk about this more in the next session. Basically, these folks from Samaria said, we're going to take our marbles and we're going to go home. And in that going home, they're going to build a rival temple on Mount Gerizim. And that rival temple has been excavated. And fascinating information comes from this. A refinement of the chronology which puts it exactly in the time frame of Ezra and Nehemiah. discussions. Not the earlier part of Ezra, but Ezra, Nehemiah, when Ezra finally comes and Nehemiah is there. Here's the plan of part of that. This is actually the part, the right hand is the part that has been exposed. There's a church that is there, octagonal church on top of it. This is the gateway into that earlier complex of the temple there on the Mount Gerizim. Here is a drawing of that and a photograph of the area. Here's an aerial view with that church complex, but the gate area that we were looking at is over there. These are the flight of steps by which people could access this. Now, from Mount Gerizim, this is Mount Gerizim on the left-hand side. Mount Ebal is on the right. You remember the story in the book of Deuteronomy where God tells Moses when the children of Israel get there, 6 tribes on one side, 6 tribes on the other, and the reading of the curses? And everybody shall say amen. It's at this scene where that is supposed to unfold. It's narrated as being accomplished in the book of Joshua, where the children of Israel, after the conquest of Ai, go to these 2 mountains and they follow through with this covenant renewal. There's a lot more that is involved there, but I'm going to leave it alone. On top of Mount Gerizim is where that temple is located, and this photograph is from there. Mount Gerizim is this in the foreground. And as you look down the slope, Old Testament Shechem is there. You can see it. And there's another site of great significance over here on the far right-hand side, and it's where Jacob's well is situated. Obviously, 2 significantly disparate chronological episodes. Where's my timekeeper? Where? I'm not 7 minutes over, am I? Oh, okay. All right. Thank you. Stand up whenever we get closer, please. So these are 2 very disparate episodes chronologically. Shechem, of course, is a huge site associated with Old Testament narrative. Jacob's well, I hope you remember it, John chapter 4. And Jesus is there. The disciples have gone into Sychar to get food. And as he's... What happened? Time's up. Maybe we are time's up. Okay. I forgot which of the lectures I talk about this in. So you're going to have to come back to the next one in order to hear me discuss this further. But in a footnote, what's happening is Jesus at that Jacob's well is talking to the woman, and the discussion moves to where should the worship be done? Now, to an extent, Jesus sweeps it aside and says the time is coming when it will no longer be geocentric. You know, wherever you are and worshiping in spirit and truth, that's where the legitimate worship takes place. But she says, our fathers worshipped in this mountain. And she's talking about Gerizim. But it's in Jerusalem where you say people ought to worship. And she's wanting some clarification here. And Jesus says, it's going to be a new world, folks. It's going to be a different world where, for some of you, thankfully you don't have to make a pilgrimage. For some of us, I make a pilgrimage every summer, but not for religious reasons. The next session, we're going to talk more specifically about the issues associated with Ezra and Nehemiah, but I want to sort of pique your interest here. I want to talk about where Esther fits into all of this. I know that wasn't the assignment, but there's a very important contribution that's going on in the book of Esther that sets the scene for Ezra and Nehemiah very, very significantly.